Make Way for Ducklings by Robert McCloskey. Mr. and Mrs. Mallard were looking for a place to live, but every time Mr. Mallard saw what looked like a nice place, Mrs. Mallard said it was no good. There were sure to be foxes in the woods or turtles in the water, and she was not going to raise a family where there might be foxes or turtles, so they flew on and on. When they got to Boston, they felt too tired to fly any further. There was a nice pond in the public garden, with a little island on it. The very place to spend the night, quacked Mr. Mallard, so they flapped. Next morning they fished for their breakfast in the mud at the bottom of the pond, but they didn't find much. Just as they were getting ready to start on their way, a strange, enormous bird came by. It was pushing a boat full of people, and there was a man sitting on its back. "Good morning," quacked Mr. Mallard, being polite. The big bird was too proud to answer, but the people on the boat threw peanuts into the water, so the Mallards followed them all round the pond and got another breakfast, better than the first. I don't actually think this big bird was being rude. If you look carefully here at the pictures, it's a swan boat, but the Mallards didn't know that. "I like this place," said Mrs. Mallard, as they climbed out on the bank and waddled along. "Why don't we build a nest and raise our ducklings right in this pond? There are no foxes and no turtles, and the people feed us peanuts. What could be better?" "Good," said Mr. Mallard, delighted that at last Mrs. Mallard had found a place suited her. But, I wonder what's going to happen. What's going to be the problem? Let's see. "Look out," squawked Mrs. Mallard. "All of a dither. You'll get run over," and when she got her breath she added, "This is no place for babies. With all those horrid things rushing about, we'll have to look somewhere else." They almost got run over by this boy going so fast on his bike. I wonder where the Mallards are going to go. So they flew over Beacon Hill and round the State House, but there was no place there. It's because there's no water for them to swim in. They looked in Louisburg Square, but there was no water. Then they flew over the Charles River. "This is better," quacked Mr. Mallard. "That island looks like a nice, quiet place, and it's only a little way from the public garden." "Yes," said Mrs. Mallard, remembering the peanuts. "That looks just like the right place to hatch our ducklings." So they chose a cozy spot among the bushes near the water and settled down to build their nest, and only just in time, for now they were beginning to molt, and all their old wing feathers started to drop out, and they would not be able to fly again until the new ones grew in. But of course they could swim, and one day they swam over the park on the river bank, and there they met a policeman named Michael. Michael fed them peanuts, and after that the Mallards called on Michael every day. That was really nice of Michael to feed them peanuts. I'm sure they enjoyed it. One day the ducklings hatched out. First came Jack, then Cack, and then Lack, then Mack, and Knack, and a whack, and Pack, and Quack. Mr. and Mrs. Mallard were bursting with pride. It was a great responsibility taking care of so many ducklings, and it kept them very busy. I can't imagine having 8 babies all at once. Can you? One day Mr. Mallard decided he'd like to take a trip to see what the rest of the river was like further on, so off he set. "I'll meet you in a week in the public garden," he squawked over his shoulder. "Take good care of the ducklings. Don't you worry," said Mrs. Mallard. "I know all about bringing up children." And she did. She taught them how to swim and dive. She taught them to walk in a line, to come when they were called, to keep a safe distance from bikes and scooters and other things with wheels. Mrs. Mallard sure has a lot to teach her baby ducklings. When at last she felt perfectly satisfied with them, she said one morning, "Come on, children, follow me." Before you could wink an eye, Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Oack, Pack, and Quack fell into line, just as they had been taught. Mrs. Mallard led the way into the water, and they swam behind her to the opposite bank. I wonder where they're going. There they waded ashore and waddled along till they came to the highway. Uh-oh. Look at the picture closely. They're gonna try to cross the highway. Oh man, I hope they do okay. 8 ducklings and the mom. Mrs. Mallard stepped out across the road. Honk, honk went the horns on the speeding cars. Quack went Mrs. Mallard, and she tumbled back again. Quack, 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 quack went Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Oack, Pack, and Quack, just as loud as their little quackers could quack. The cars kept speeding by and honking, and Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings kept right on, quack, quack, quacking. I hope nobody gets hit by a car. And they made such a noise that Michael came running, waving his arms and blowing his whistle, tweet, 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 as the mallards went quack, quack, quack. He planted himself in the center of the road, raised one hand to stop the traffic, and beckoned with the other, the way policemen do, for the mallards to cross over. Thank God Michael came just in time. He called Clancy at headquarters and said, "There's a family of ducks walking down the street." Clancy said, "A family of what?" "Ducks," yelled Michael. "Send a police car, quick!" Meanwhile, Mrs. Mallard had reached the corner bookshop and turned into Charles Street, with Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Oack, Pack, and Quack all marching in line behind her. When they came to the corner of Beacon Street, there was the police car with 4 policemen that Clancy had sent from headquarters. The policemen held back the traffic so Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings could march across the street. That was very nice of them. Right on into the public garden. Have any of you ever been to the public garden before in Boston? That's exactly where this book is right now. On this page right here, that's the public garden. Inside the gate they all turned round to say thank you to the policeman. The policeman smiled and waved goodbye. When they reached the pond and swam across to the little island, there was Mr. Mallard waiting for them, just as he had promised. I wonder what the baby ducklings think of their new home. The ducklings liked the new island so much that they decided to live there. All day long they followed the swan boat and, what do you think they ate? And they ate peanuts from the fans who threw them overboard. And when night falls, they swim to their little island and go to sleep. The end.